Okay, it's 7 o'clock, so I think I'm going to go ahead and start. I want to welcome everyone to Apalachee Audubon Society's May program meeting. I am Donna Laguerre, and this is my last meeting serving as president. It's been an odd year to serve. I miss seeing your faces and hearing your voices. It's very strange to not have feedback, even smiles. It's very odd. But I do think that we have made the most of the pandemic in converting our monthly meetings to a Zoom format. And I really want to thank our communication chair, Dara Wilson, for that. She's run these Zoom meetings very effectively. So I really do appreciate Dara. Our program theme this past year has been access to nature. And our programs range from providing access to parks for people of different abilities with a speaker from the Florida Disabled Outdoors Association, to a program by an environmental educator whose mission it is to help people of color find access to local resources that connect them to fun nature experiences and become environmental stewards. We had one session on the management of Leon County forested parks and how to access them. And then there was our Pines to Palms program, where we brought together 4 highly successful natural resource managers who varied in age, sex, and race to discuss how they each got involved in forestry and wildlife management and environmental education, and how we can encourage young folks, especially minority students, to consider natural resource careers. We canceled our wildlife-friendly yard tour this year, but we did produce our own video of board member Rob Williams' yard on how to enhance wildlife habitat in a standard yard in a standard neighborhood, just by planting native trees, shrubs, and wildflowers, and a few other techniques. You can watch this on Apalachee Audubon Society's YouTube channel. In December, we installed a bat house at Lake Alberta City Park. We continue to tend the wildflower patches there. It's in full bloom right now, I hear. We worked with the city personnel last fall to remove invasive plants at Lake Alberta. We managed the martin colony there, putting up the gourds, taking them down. We prefer to do that with children from one of the city parks, recreation centers, but this year that was canceled. And we organized a trash removal day at the park. And when we were removing that trash, we actually had a full canoe full of trash that Jody and Nelson removed from the peninsula out there. This program was actually organized by our FAMU intern and a WFSU high school intern from Sale. On the conservation front, we monitored and had input on Florida Forever, MCORs, blueprint plans, and we reviewed several state park management plans, among other things. We have also partnered with Tall Timbers through their grant with Cornell Lab of Ornithology by providing volunteer birders to visit conservation easement lands where they birded using the eBird app and taught the property owners how to use it so that birds can be counted on these large private tracts of land as well as on public lands. So yes, we have been very busy. Unfortunately, our after-school bird club at Pineview Elementary was canceled for this year. It will start up with the new school year with our FAMU intern taking the lead. I am putting together an environmental education committee now, so please let me know if you want to be a part of this excellent bird club program at Pineview or any other aspect of environmental education, from tabling to leading bird walks. Finally, I want to put a thank you out to our departing board members, Chase Bressel, Amelia Fisaro, Peter Gorin, Peter Kelly, and Liz Schold, and really thank them for their service. And I also want to welcome our new board member, Caleb Crow. I think most of you that are members received an email and where you could vote on the ballot. So I'm giving you the results of that. Our elected officers for next year are President Kathleen Carr, Interim Vice President Heather Levy, Treasurer Harvey Goldman, and Secretary Nelson Ball. We have a total of 12 people that will be serving on the board next year. And we hope that some of you that are watching right now will sign up for committees or projects. You certainly don't have to be on the board to volunteer. Also, just one quick announcement, no meetings over the summer. So that our next program meeting hopefully will be in person and will be in September. Now I'd like to introduce Tallulah Bletskov, an FSU student who participated in Florida Audubon CLI, that stands for Conservation Leadership Initiative program, under the mentorship of board member Dara Wilson. This was a year-long program. Tallulah has participated in board meetings, birding outings, and on various projects throughout the year, and now has the pleasure of introducing tonight's speaker, Jeff VanderMeer. And I want to personally thank Jeff for agreeing to do this program tonight and for his willingness to help us in the past and hopefully in the future. Tallulah.
Thank you, Donna. Hello, everyone. I'm Tallulah Bletskov, Apalachee Audubon CLI intern this semester. The CLI program was introduced by Audubon Society in order to give undergraduate college students a chance to immerse themselves in Audubon, strengthen leadership skills, and gain an understanding of career opportunities in conservation. And again, I want to thank you all for attending our last online program of the 2020-2021 season. Apalachee Audubon Society is very pleased to welcome New York Times bestselling novelist and author of the newly released eco-thriller Hummingbird Salamander, Jeff VanderMeer. Jeff VanderMeer's New York Times bestselling Southern Reach trilogy has been translated into over 35 languages. The first novel, Annihilation, won the Nebula Award and Shirley Jackson Award and was made into a movie by Paramount in 2018. Recent works include Dead Astronauts, Borne, a finalist for the Arthur C. Clarke Award, and The Strange Bird. These novels, set in the Borne universe, are being developed for TV by AMC and continue to explore themes related to the environment, animals, and our future. Called the Weird Thoreau by The New Yorker, VanderMeer frequently speaks about issues related to climate change and storytelling. VanderMeer lives in Tallahassee, Florida with his wife Anne, cat Neo, and a yard full of native plants. And now, nature as an inspiration for writing and other thoughts, with Jeff VanderMeer.
Thank you for that lovely introduction, and thanks to you all for inviting me to speak today. I believe very strongly in Audubon's mission, and I know the folks involved here in North Florida are engaged in actions and with ideas that are incredibly powerful and restorative. Even just hearing some of the projects that you've been involved with this year. The connections and decisions made within this organization and in concert with other environmental organizations in the area make such a difference to me and to a lot of people and to the Florida that we know and love. I do need to express support for the Audubon employees trying to get Audubon at a national level to recognize their union. That seems very reasonable and important to me. And also, I would like to donate my honorarium tonight back into our local Audubon chapter. That's for what I'm going to speak about tonight. And forgive me, I've done 45 straight Zoom events over the last month and a half, so my voice is getting a little scratchy. As for what I'm about to speak, what I'm going to speak about tonight, I will rove a little widely talking about nature in my writing because I have spent the last 20 or 30 years exploring nature, the non-human, including birds, and environmental issues in my fiction and also in my nonfiction. And that will include some thoughts about my novel Annihilation, our recent rewilding efforts in our Tallahassee yard, where one of the major goals has been to make it a better sanctuary for migratory birds. And I am very happy to say that this year we have a robust new crop of rufous-sided tuis and great crested flycatchers, which is a source of great joy to me. You can also, if you want to, if you're listening, but also want to see some images, rather than try to do the awkward thing of importing slides into Zoom, all you have to do is go to my hashtag Vanderwild on Twitter to get a sense of some of the things going on with the yard and other issues related to what I'm going to talk about. So where should I start? I thought I would start with the first time that I wrote directly about Florida because it's somewhat instructive. And I did this by making up a fake squid. So long before the success of Annihilation, I wrote a series set in an imaginary fantasy city that included a celebration called the Festival of the Freshwater Squid. And I wrote about this fantastical festival for years without anything particularly odd happening. What did happen tended to fall into one of three categories. Category the first, dried squid, tons and acres of it. More dried squid than there are undried squid. Every year, without fail, people sent me dried squid in the mail. They still do. Never the same people, I must add. So there was some relief in that. Now, I don't actually like to eat squid, but it's the thought that kind of disturbs me. Category the second, pictures of squid, hand-drawn, cut out of magazines, photocopied evidence of squid. And I'm tempted to say I already knew what squid looked like, but the truth is I didn't because there are so many different kinds, but now I do. Category the third, squid sightings all over the world in every language, posted on a myriad of websites. If it makes the news, I know about it still to this day. Sent the link from dozens and dozens of people. Look, a squid has been sighted. We thought you'd like to know. And kind of the subtext, aren't you going to do something about it? I had been selected to bear witness to squid sightings. It is my burden. It is my talent. It is still ongoing even through the pandemic year. And I've been touched through really through all of this, very touched and moved that people would care enough. But what am I supposed to do with the information? This is the question I always ask myself. And yet, as I say, this was hugely flattering. People I didn't know had read my books and been so energized that they had taken time off from doing good deeds, robbing banks, or going to get groceries to send me stuff. But then things changed because I changed the paradigm. And I think this is fairly key to writing about animals in this day and age. I brought my Festival of the Freshwater Squid into the real world. So I had had the experience of traveling around small town Florida for one job or another and experienced its endless array of crafts fairs, art shows, and yes, festivals. And I developed a strange affection for these events. They were genuine. They weren't that commercial. People enjoyed them. So I decided to lovingly send them up. I decided to write about a made-up festival. And I set it in Sebring, Florida, in the center of the state during the summer. I wrote about it as if I were a reporter doing an article for a newspaper. And I lacked only one thing, squid, freshwater squid. So I did a lot of research and I created the mayfly squid. As you may or probably do not know, the tiny freshwater squid is an invasive species brought to Florida by mistake on container ships from Brazil. Now it lives in the lakes in and around Sebring, a whole industry and subculture growing up around it, nurturing it. T-shirts, plastic glow-in-the-dark squid keychains, self-published tell-all guides to the squid and festivities. The festival starts with a parade through town, after which the mayfly squid queen, in her glowing tiara, flashing neon dress, and her special clear plastic hollow platform shoes, goes out onto the lake in a special squid boat. And her shoes, of course, are filled with squid. Once on the lake, the mayfly squid queen releases the squid from her shoes into the water just in time for the mating season. While back on shore, the celebration has already started. Drunk tourists wearing squid hats, eating squid ink ice cream, keeping chiropractors in business by allowing themselves to be wrenched around for 5 minutes at a time on squid-shaped amusement rides. Harmless fun, right? The results were published on a fiction website, complete with diagrams and photographs and footnotes to scholarly essays from scientific journals. End of story. Except it wasn't. Two rather strange things happened, one quickly, one slowly. Strange situation the first, an angry email, an irate phone call, both from a cephalopod expert at the University of Texas in Galveston. Online research, my story, the page detailing the physiology and mating habits of the mayfly squid. And I imagined as he read this page, the cephalopod expert became more and more indignant. A rage arose within him as he realized with mounting horror that I had created a whole new Florida squid, indeed something never seen before, a freshwater squid. Do you know just how difficult squid taxonomy already is, he asked me. Don't go screwing around with people's heads with your, and the contempt in these last words before he hung up the phone cannot be overstated, fake squid. Strange situation the second. Over a period of 2 or 3 years, unbeknownst to me, bewildering several, the Sebring Chamber of Commerce began to get some mighty strange phone calls and emails. When will the Festival of the Freshwater Squid be held this year? Do you have a brochure about the event? Is it family friendly? Freshwater what? Squid Festival? First brought to my attention when the local Sebring newspaper called to set up an interview about, as they called it, the situation, resulting in a much more explicit "this is fiction" warning on each page of the online story. As for the Festival of the Freshwater Squid, things only got worse. A fisherman in Louisiana contacted me and posted on angler message boards to alert people to the fact that the mayfly squid was heading north. He had seen it. He had caught 2 in a swamp. This must be stopped. Then 2 years after that, and I kid you not, a BBC wildlife show producer emailed me to say that she would be in the Everglades with her crew, and she would like to come up to Sebring, Florida to film me walking around a lake talking about the freshwater squid. Now, I was tempted. I thought for sure I knew someone who could make a rubber model. I had a friend who had a scuba suit. So I really did, unfortunately, think about the possibility of somehow pulling this off. But in the end, I rather thought it would end badly for me. It might become too real. And besides, my conscience, i.e. my wife, Anne, said that it was a terrible idea. And that's usually when things come to a halt. For a long time, I thought this story about this story had no real moral, except that the world is absurd. But the more time passed, I realized that what had happened encapsulated a lot of things about the interaction between people and animals, about how stories about animals enter the common culture, and what's acceptable and what isn't in mixing fiction and fact when it comes to nature. The original story itself had in some ways too encapsulated the sometimes endearing ways and sometimes not so endearing ways we include animals in our rituals and our imagination. However, it was also a little scarring. So the next time I had to make up an animal, I asked a friend, biologist Dr. Megan Brown, to do so. She created the hummingbird and the salamander for my latest novel, Hummingbird Salamander. And not only did this feel safer, but also she was an expert in a way I could never be, no matter how much research I did. And in fact, if you look at the material in the novel, if you are a scientist who knows hummingbirds and salamanders, there's not just a lot of in-jokes, there's a lot of allusions to things in the field of biology and the history of science that I never would have thought of. I had chosen the hummingbird in part because of hummingbirds' typically long migrations and what that means in a current age when much of their range is threatened by poisons from agriculture or development. Because in the sense of story, there was something heroic about a bird that goes on a journey of thousands of miles and survives against the odds and does this each and every year. But the trick in storytelling, and this includes writing about nature, is often distance from the subject. In addition to Dr. Brown's expertise, I sought distance from my own experience of hummingbirds, including a formative experience at an early age in Cusco, so that I could engage with storytelling that wasn't about me, but about someone else, the main character in the novel, Jane. What you find when someone else makes up part of the story is a kind of useful collaboration in reaction and in constraint. And aspects of the novel changed on the nature side, specifically because I had not created either the hummingbird or the salamander myself. For example, I had planned to just mention the long migration. But with Dr. Brown's words to quote, the entire journey exists in the novel. And I think that's important in terms of giving the non-human the spotlight, in terms of dramatizing and in a useful semi-anthropomorphizing way, tying the hummingbird's journey to Jane's own quest to discover the truth about a mystery involving a dead eco-activist. So clearly, I've been writing about animals for a while with varying results, and this has taken the form of presenting fiction as nonfiction, of creating animals that speak for themselves, as in my novel Dead Astronauts, where a genetically altered fox speaks directly to the reader, which begins to go from a species level to a more individual animal level. And the last part of that process is something I've come to late, in which I want to talk about at more length because I feel it's important, which is to say it's heavily influenced by rewilding, the urban contribution to habitat restoration, which is, for those who don't know the term, and I think all of you all do, but I'll say this anyway, my apologies, is about working with plants native to an area pre-settler, pre-Columbus, so that it regains some measure of its biodiversity, sometimes also by removing non-native invasive plants that have no value for wildlife. Perhaps one reason it took so long for me to come to the idea of rewilding and of native Florida plants and everything that brings in about habitat and biodiversity is because it took time for me to settle into a sense of place, of being anchored to and suffused with a place. I was born in Pennsylvania, but my parents, one an artist and one an entomologist, joined the Peace Corps when I was only 4, and we moved to the Fiji Islands. We stayed there for almost 6 years, and it truly was a tropical paradise, the kind of place where there's little remove between you and the natural world. To be surrounded by and engaged with nature was simply what you did when you woke up in the morning. Getting lost on the edge of a shallow reef at night and becoming reoriented because of a huge phosphorescent starfish was not, to the young me, that extraordinary an event. And so this was something I expected about my life, that nature would always be there and I would always have access to it. And this is what has been reflected in my writing. Coming back to the US, my dad got a job at Cornell and we endured 2 very un-Fijian, unhappy winters in Ithaca before getting the hell out and moving to Florida. In Florida, I found a place that reminded me of Fiji, that in both habitat and climate kept bringing up good memories of the place I had left behind. First in Gainesville, where I lived through college and became attached to the wonderful habitat of Payne's Prairie. I actually once leapt over a huge gator at Payne's Prairie because there was no other way to get back across the trail. And then Tallahassee, with all the wealth of unique wilderness that we can find here, including what has become for me a lodestar, the St. Mark's National Wildlife Refuge, perhaps because it's the first hike that I took when I came up to North Florida. Now, I tell you this because sometimes being surrounded by a wealth of habitats and quote unquote nature, you take it for granted. And in the sense of thinking of nature as the thing I left the house to go hiking in, this is definitely true. Even as an adult in Tallahassee at our first house, where I lived from 1992 to 2018, I didn't really think about our yard as a habitat or a sanctuary for wildlife. I was clued in enough and broke enough not to use harmful chemicals in the yard and not to cut down trees. But I did spend an awful lot of time putting down grass sod, hoping to have a traditional lawn. That failed rather spectacularly each single time. And I didn't think further about the yard really until after we'd lived there for over 2 decades. One of the changes in my perspective and my advocacy that have occurred since then, I can date back to a moment of crisis, the Gulf oil spill in 2010. As I'm sure a lot of you remember, this inflicted damage mentally as well as physically in the way that suddenly the oil was gushing out in the Gulf and it couldn't be contained. And for many of us, it was gushing in our minds and we could not get away from it. It was haunting us day and night, a phantom sound, a phantom thought. And for a time, if you recall, for more than a month, it wasn't clear the well would ever be capped. And so many of us thought this catastrophe could last for years and the Gulf and the Gulf Coast would be in essence gone. Even after they capped the well, it was still somewhere in the back of my mind. And eventually that dark swirl coalesced into the novel I'm best known for, Annihilation, set in a never-named North Florida and dealing with a host of environmental issues. Now, by the time of the Gulf oil spill, I had lived in North Florida for almost 20 years. And through my hiking and experiences in the wilderness along that coast, I had felt for the first time like I belonged in a place, in a landscape. The oil spill crystallized that and brought the issues and dangers facing Florida into sharp relief. And I really wish it hadn't taken that, but that's the truth. The success of the novel meant, too, that I got to travel to more places in Florida, giving readings and presentations and meeting with scientists and conservationists. So in a sense, the book brought me closer to my own backyard. It kind of flicked a switch. Then, and this is pretty key too, my wife and I moved to upstate New York for a semester, a residency at a college in the Finger Lakes district in the fall of 2016. The relationship of wildlife to the house we lived in was very different. It was more obvious. For example, one night I walked out because I heard a commotion and I surprised a deer, a skunk, and a raccoon who were having some kind of discussion that was not going well. And the relationship between farmers, hunters, and environmentalists was very different. And it's not really relevant, but we did actually get shot at by turkey hunters because I misunderstood the information about the seasons of the wildlife management areas there. So it became apparent I hadn't thought enough about our yard in Tallahassee at all when we came back, or really about the Florida equivalent of the alliances and antagonisms I witnessed in upstate New York. So when we returned to Tallahassee after the 2016 elections as distraction, I planted salvia and put up more bird feeders and thought about our yard much differently. I attempted a nascent rewilding in a very silly way by just throwing wildflower seeds that I bought online around willy-nilly. And thankfully, the non-native ones died out, but the salvia, which I believe, hold in my heart, was native, took over. Yet, given the small lot was heavily wooded with native trees, there wasn't much more to be done. And frankly, once the Biden's Alba and goldenrod popped up, there wasn't room to plant anything else. When we moved in late 2018 to a new house on the edge of a wooded ravine in this suburban neighborhood that's only 10 minutes from the state capitol, I didn't expect to become totally obsessed with rewilding, but I soon had to because the lovely jungle behind the house turned out to be invasive air potato vine, invasive ferns, well, I mean, you know the litany of this, invasive spiderwort and invasive nandina bushes, as well as invasive coral ardesia. It was the perfect toxic cocktail of plants. Once I learned this, I was first of all shocked and then horrified because there was so much wildlife down there that potentially was being kind of choked off or compromised over time by basically a lack of food. And I had wondered why, despite it being such a thick, lush woods behind our house, that there weren't as many birds as I would have thought there would have been. So I engaged in a prolonged battle to remove the invasives and plant native plants that's still ongoing in our third year. And it became a process whereby with each new thing I learned about native plants and how urban and suburban wilderness becomes a food desert for wildlife when the invasives take over, the more determined I became. Because of the luxury of working at home and being able to set my own hours, I would write each morning and I would spend each afternoon in the yard. I feel like my wife at one point probably felt like I was becoming the obsessed Richard Dreyfuss character who eventually builds a mound of mashed potatoes in the living room. In that she would probably look out down into the ravine and she would see this 50-something man frantically on his hands and knees digging out air potato tubers for hours. So I think all told removed about 4,000 air potato tubers, tons of ivy, maybe 2,000 coral ardesia bushes, and about 200 nandina bushes. And even taking into account that fiction writers are known to exaggerate, that's still pretty accurate. Native nurseries was, of course, a huge help in this regard, and individuals in the community like Lily Bird, Eleanor Dietrich, and more recently Ethan Vogel, to name just three. It's also included learning what to plant from native nurseries and planting over time over 400 native bushes, understory trees, and wildflowers. And, the results, you all know this, we've now spotted over the last 2 years, especially over 103 species of bird that have come through the yard. I mentioned the fact that we have the tuis in the front, which has more of a scrub kind of aspect to it, and all kinds of other microhabitats where birds that wouldn't have felt welcome before have some area where they can, eat, whether they're migratory or here year round, they can find food to eat. And although I cannot yet revive the dry creek bed running down the bottom of the ravine, I can and have put in hardshell ponds as water source. And my point in relating this, which again, I feel like for this audience, maybe you already know all of that and you've experienced it in your own yards and lives. But it affected me very profoundly as a writer, and it's still affecting me. And it's not something that I expected. I didn't know pulling at the little string of the native plant subject would release all these other things. Some of you may have read the initial indications of that change in my monthly Wild Tallahassee column for the Tallahassee Democrat, which is a direct result of that rewilding, and is also trying to recast common urban wildlife in a way that gets rid of very harmful stereotypes and cliches. A large part of that column, and being so hands-on and connected to this little half acre, is that I've come to know individual animals and individual birds in a way that I haven't before. And if you do explore my Twitter hashtag Vanderwild, you'll come across some of the names: Raccoon Mother, the Trader Jesse Bunn, most recently 2 new additions, Lil Buntastic, and Tater Bean, who is a baby possum who's wandering around the backyard. Including observation on the trail cam, I know very well the individual personalities and proclivities of the 6 to 8 raccoons that call this ravine home. I know the possums by their very different facial markings. I can tell one summer tanager male from the other based on how bold the one is and how shy the other is, and also by their distinctive liquid plonk of a call, which I take such delight in hearing as they move around the yard. And oddly, also from the uniqueness of this house, the way it hugs the side of the ravine, so that I have insight into bird flight that I didn't have before, which has factored into the fiction. In the wide open space right outside the living room windows, which is basically halfway up the ravine, so partially in the canopy, I get to see the lazy, indecisive flutter of doves descending to the bird feeder far below, the crazed geometry of blue jays as they fly like miniature fighter planes from one magnolia tree to another before their own more decisive descent to the feeder. How the red-shouldered hawks think both vertically and horizontally in hugging the middle distance, as they sometimes hop fly from the middle branches of one tree to another tree, seeking to be invisible as they gauge possible prey, to give just some examples. One thing about writing about nature in fiction too is I feel it is so important not to fudge the details. The miracles and the awe live in the specific details. And as a writer, it's invaluable to have these experiences so that when I write about nature, it's from specific observation. This is so important to me that I vowed on the Southern Reach trilogy that every aspect of nature described would be something I had experienced firsthand. But also, once again, with the rewilding, I find myself in another layer of what it means to tell stories about nature, to write about nature, this time at the level of individual observation. And I already know that it will change how I tell the stories of animals in my fiction. And this very individual element, again, has come about almost completely from learning about native plants, because everything about animals comes out of the habitat and the conditions of the landscape that allows them to flourish. It has also shown me the invisible world that inhabits our yard, for better or worse, in disavowing the use of chemical fertilizer, herbicide, and pesticide in creating our native plants' yard. Those elements have become so very, very visible in places around the yard, outside of the yard, I mean. And this is a source of very human alarm at the harm we do to the world. But it also provides a sense of the layering and the balancing one must do when telling stories about nature, because we can't pretend that it hasn't been affected by human beings, even some of our most wild places. And that too is the story of the non-human world. The things we can't see, but must be able to see and hopefully show to others when we write about nature. So after even just rewilding the yard and realizing there is, for example, a wealth of indigenous land management in the history of many of these plants and all the complexities and issues to be found there, the world of fiction can seem a little too simple, a little lacking in truth, to put it bluntly, or perhaps not always looking in the right places. At an earth-wide level rather than a yard-wide level, we also live in a world in which eating meat is synonymous with increasing the effects of global warming. We live in a world in which we have killed off half of our terrestrial wildlife since 1970. We live in a world in which we have accepted that one of the least efficient modes of transportation ever created, the car, will be okay if we just make it driverless or manage to reduce its carbon imprint. And we're grappling with the idea that the world is being remade by plastic waste and that solar farms can still be bad for the environment. In this context, fiction writers need to find ways to portray the future that don't reduce the complexity of the world and the contradictions. And in these and so many other ways, fiction has to push back against a lot of received ideas and norms. And, you know, I have to do that with the neighbors sometimes with regard to explaining what I'm doing in the yard. So I don't think this is just a problem for fiction writers. I don't think that it's really about, the thing I get asked the most is, what do you have hope about? You know, why do you write dystopias as opposed to utopias? And I think that it's really not about that at all. It's about crucial corrections in our foundational ideas. It's making sure that our fiction isn't just responding in opposition to a granularity of the real world that, due to many of our politicians, sadly, is currently very crude. And also that it should be possible to find in the midst of distress those genuine micro-utopias and the moments that ameliorate and heal. Just as fiction requires distance, sometimes it does require joy in moments of beauty, and it does so because this is a form of truth about the human condition and about wilderness. One of the things that grounds me and brings me back to myself, even when there is bad environmental news, is the connection to our yard, to the plants and animals there, and how living in the moment of that reminds me of what's important for everything, including human beings. Which brings me back to animals, including birds, because they are the ambassadors of nature for most readers, but because they are also let into our world by the human imagination in ways more direct than, for example, how we usually think about plants. In this context, another major reevaluation or rethinking we need to accomplish in the world and in our writings and storytellings about the world is to finally admit to the true complexity and value of animal life. We need to do this because it is only moral and ethical choice, but also because our attitude towards animals, our attitude towards birds at times even, and lack of protections for them has hastened the worst of global warming through indiscriminate habitat collapse and the unraveling of complex ecosystems. The thought by some of rewilding all the yards in the US to combat development and desecration elsewhere is a useful one, but it is also in some ways just a patch on a larger problem. Questions arise the more we think with clarity about animals and the more we learn about animal behavior. Why would a noted science fiction writer write a story, for example, in which a parrot in a cage all its life tells its story only to in the end absolve humanity for imprisonment? How can Harper's run without fact-checking against the latest animal behavior studies, a piece in which the author goes off on an extended riff about how animals cannot perceive death or mourn? Even a seemingly innocuous movie like Terrence Malick's New World creates agitprop by depicting a past starved of animals, despite accounts from that era of sheer numbers of birds, for example, that would to the modern mind appear ridiculous if shown on the screen. How do we stop normalizing the decline of nature by pushing back against these kinds of stories? Portraying animals correctly doesn't have to occur on an epic scale. In novels like Wall Creeper by Nell Zink, we see an excellent portrayal of ecological efforts at the tactical neighborhood level, also illuminating the lives of birds. Even the contemporary relationship novel The Portable Veblen by Elizabeth Mackenzie finds ways to be observant on related subjects. In pushing back against the idea of trapping a squirrel in their attic, the main character tells her fiancé, "Some people would say people hate squirrels because that's the only way to motivate expenditures on them, such as buying traps or guns. It's the same with stirring up patriotic nationalism because it justifies the expenditures for a defense." This speaks directly to the outdated thought processes and junk science used out west in, for example, coyote culling. Other examples that fall into this category but could also be thought of as more radical would be to use the actual structures of animal bodies and the structures of their life cycles to house and make fresh traditional storylines. And in general, what if fiction emphasized the positive through innovation by rejecting traditional hard technology, thinking of the smartphone not as a kind of evolution, but the end product of exploitation, as an example of tactical refinements or replications occurring within an ever smaller space constrained by scarcity of resources and based on exhausted methodologies and ideologies? And then what if instead we started investing our storytelling at the subatomic level with the idea of efficiencies from the natural world, biomimicry, regardless of the issue of consciousness, as being both more logical and more intricate than what we ourselves create? In what ways could we mimic the natural world in our storytelling, create manifestations of it in our culture that might have positive and real substantive effects? My own efforts include the novella The Strange Bird, which tries to imagine narrative vertically, not horizontally, and to use the attributes of birds, flight, ability to sense electromagnetic fields as ways to reduce the stage business involved in a journey, Bird flight, even more than human modes of transportation, including walking, can cover vast distances and changes in context without the need for the ordinary kinds of transitional text or remove the need for a scene break. It also contains, encoded in its DNA to most humans, a lyricism that permits a more breathless style as a mimicry of the act of flight. It allows a style that might otherwise feel ornate or mannered to function not as hyperreal, but as the real. And inasmuch as flight, in its effortlessness suggests music and birds create music, this also reinforces a poetic approach, which, if I'm right, indicates that writing from some semblance of a non-human viewpoint can bring with it a host of associations that a writer can take advantage of to create both renovations and even innovations that aren't intellectual exercises, but felt in the body of the reader to create genuine transcendence. Now, all of this said, we live in uncertain times here in Florida and in general throughout the world. We all know the weather is changing, the planting zones are beginning to shift. We know that sea level rise is in our future. We know that we will have to be ever more vigilant and imaginative in how we manage our natural resources to hold on to them, which is to say things are going to get more fraught, not less. In some areas, and I'm not engaging in hyperbole, you may in the next 20 years engage in projects and actions either in the private or public sector that mean the difference between life and death for whole categories of plants, insects, and animals. That what you do from this moment and into the future, your passion, your drive, your love for the world, will have a material effect on the quality of life for your fellow human beings and for the non-human world. I will also say that there is an element of loss to this. We will lose more even as we gain more. But the things that haunt us are often the things we care about and have connection to. And if they are also the things that matter, we either need to become cynics and change the things we care about so we don't care when they're destroyed, so the haunting of it cannot affect us, or more bravely and with more effort, let them haunt us, even if it is painful, and through that haunting, find some kind of act or agency or storytelling that is meaningful. And one part of that is engaging in the best, most effective storytelling about this amazing world that we live in, finding the ways that work for you, even in your daily lives, even if just trying to convince a neighbor about the importance of that patch of native wildflowers they find unruly, because there's a whole world of association in just that one clump of flowers, if you really think about it. In writing about nature and using nature as a way of thinking about writing, my major source of hope and what sustains me is simply that what we call the natural world or nature is not fragile, it is not weak. The evidence is simple. In the face of an all-out war, there is so much of it still out there. Given a space, a crack, a moment, given half a chance, it can thrive. In this new house, at one time 40 years ago, the creek bed ran through the bottom of the ravine. A wealth of animals long gone would have passed through, drawn by water. Now the creek is gone, diverted by the city, only filling up when it rains. Over the years, so many have without thought allowed pollutants to degrade the ravine. They have let invasive plants of no food value to wildlife proliferate. They have used pesticides without an idea of what that means to life around us and cut down hundreds of healthy pine trees. And yet there is sanctuary. The slope is too steep for development. A wide trough of woodland remains. It's rare, but deer do still pass through. There are, as I've mentioned, box turtles, black racers, armadillos, raccoons, and possums, and yes, fireflies. Every spring, the ravine is filled with hundreds of winking lights. The sound of cicadas and katydids is thunderous. Imagine if this had been a planned development, a blueprint for other developments in Tallahassee, to leave a swath of woodlands behind all the houses that connects to other forests. Basically, a better form of storytelling. Nature isn't fragile. That we haven't wiped all of it out is testament to that. And we can pretend that we can live without nature, that we are separate from it. We can pretend that we can divorce the climate crisis from the subject of biodiversity. But in the end, we won't survive that separation. Economically and in so many other ways, we will not survive destroying all of our natural habitat. In my novel Annihilation, on her own, headed for the lighthouse, the biologist comes out of the forest and has a kind of epiphany. Now a strange mood took hold of me, she writes. A strange mood as I walked silent and alone through the last of the pines and the cypress knees that seemed to float in the black water, the gray moss that coated everything. It was as if I traveled through the landscape with the sound of an expressive and intense aria playing in my ears. Everything was imbued with emotion, awash in it. And I was no longer a biologist, but somehow the crest of a wave building and building, but never crashing to shore. I saw with such new eyes the subtleties of the transition to the marsh, the salt flats, the strange quality of the light upon the habitat, the stillness of it, the sense of waiting, brought me halfway to a kind of ecstasy. Ecstasy, a sense of wonder. We know it's right because we feel it. We know what the natural world gives to us. Part of our challenge is always to make others not only understand that, but to inhabit it. We need more people to truly feel just what a miracle our world is, and that we need to sustain, nourish, and protect it. Thank you. Apologies for those small little breaks, but 42 Zoom events will take a lot out of your voice. I guess we're going to do a Q&A next.
Yeah, I can't even imagine 42. That's kind of a
Over
lot.
30 something days.
Yeah. No wonder you were.
Where am I? No.
Yeah, I'm trying to spotlight us both. Yeah, thank you. That was beautiful. That was beautiful. Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you, Jeff. And geez Louise, thank you. I don't want to cry, but that was beautiful. So thank you. I'm looking at the time. We have about 12 minutes. So I want to hop right to it, because last time we ran a little bit over because I was so enraptured in our last speaker, and I feel a little bit that way about you, because I found myself very, I mean, you're a writer, so that's what you do. I found myself very drawn to your story, your stories, because that's what stories do. They leave you drawn to your words, hanging on to your words. So yes, thank you. I know I'm going to be talking with a girlfriend who I invited. I saw her in the chat. She even left a comment, "This is precious." I don't know if that was my girlfriend. So yes. All right. So next, someone commented already, and here they're rolling in. Something Yona asked, or she said, something I really appreciate about your work is that it is clearly in conversation with the issues that you've named, but without processualizing or even putting forward one singular solution. Can you speak on how you manage to make the text reject the status quo without getting preachy?
I think it's basically inhabiting the voice of the characters and letting the characters guide me, and they stop it from being didactic, because they're just trying to live their lives no matter what they're caught up in. And all of them are at different stages, basically, of some kind of environmental awareness or lack of awareness. And that plays into what I can actually convey through them. And so the constraint of the character, which is one of the great things about novels in terms of being able to put you in the moment and make you feel something, is really how you combat that. And then I also am very wary of putting the idea that I agree with in the mouth of the character that I most like in the narrative, because I feel like that's just too much confirmation bias in a way. So often you'll get conversations that are very muddled because you may not like the person saying the thing that you think is correct in the book, when they do actually sometimes directly talk about the environment.
Right. Yeah, I'm a huge fan of the anti-hero.
Yeah.
Yeah. Sweet. Thank you. How do you engage in nature when you travel to promote your books?
Yeah, this is a really good question. And it's one thing the pandemic has taken away from me. And it's obviously a privilege to travel. But if I was doing a physical book tour, I would actually be using all the opportunities to meet with local conservationists, citizen scientists, et cetera, who were willing to and to show me around areas. So I did a book tour at the very end of 2019 before the lockdown, before we knew there was going to be one, for my last novel. And I took the time in between to research the Pacific Northwest for hummingbird salamander. And so I did in Seattle and Portland and elsewhere. have conservationists show me like their favorite spots and talk to me about what the issues were where they were. So it becomes kind of continuing education, and then also sometimes inspiration for the novels. So that's how I use it. And also the tactile detail, like I was talking about, is so important to me. And so I'm always collecting details like that wherever I go.
Sweet, thank you. Amazing work. Very curious about two things someone says. Whose work have you engaged with to help you get into the intricacies of conveying the environment, like Jasmine Ward, for example, part one of the question, or is this more of a personal experience?
I think
that was part one.
Yeah, I don't tend to. I guess the main thing for me is, and I often get people on prior novels saying, "Oh, was this influenced by such and such fiction writer?" And in actual fact, I'm more influenced by being an amateur naturalist and from studying science and studying the intersection of various topics. I mean, so I'm not really influenced by other novels, but I get that a lot. And even with the squid research, when I was talking about the squid stuff, any fiction that has a squid in it, people tend to think I was influenced by that, but in actual fact, it's just like researching the bizarre facts about squid life, which is marvelous and strange enough and storytelling enough on its own.
I noticed that when you're rewilding your yard, just as a personal anecdote, because I feel the same way. Okay, part two of the question. What was the process around adapting a book into a film?
It was basically being told that things would be a certain way, and they went and did it. So it was really, really mind-bogglingly annoying. But at the same time, as a novice to it, I had to go through a learning process anyway. So at least now I know what the pressure points are. And on the things that are under development now, I'm going to have a much larger role. And I think they'll be a lot more faithful, especially with regard to the environment, which I think is important. So.
Sweet. For writers who don't spend much time writing about these ideas, would you say that there is still a responsibility to bring this kind of weight to what is happening to nature, happening to nature now?
That's a good question. I mean, it's always relevant. It's always dependent on the character, the position of the character in the story, and whether they would think about these things or not, and whether you as the writer can bring into the backdrop things that are relevant to it. Because the other thing is that a lot of us don't have any control as to when climate crisis actually affects us. I mean, we're privileged if we do, but a lot of times suddenly, your home is gone or whatever. So often, it's not just about what the character observes, but what happens to them. What I would say is that, I gave some examples in what I was talking about from like Nell Zink and the other Elizabeth Mackenzie novel, where there were really cool things about the environment and sometimes about climate crisis. And it didn't have to be a post-apocalyptic or a dystopian thing. It just was something that was there in the backdrop that was acknowledged as part of our life now. And that's why I think contemporary novels can be extremely important, because we're in the middle of this crisis. And what I do find weird is when I read a contemporary novel and it just seems like that element's missing and it should be there, then I wonder a little bit about whether the writer is perhaps a little more sheltered than some of the rest of us from these issues, or has chosen to be sheltered or whatever. And I think it will in the future maybe be seen as a fault. But I don't think it has to be the foreground of something necessarily.
I see another question. What other writers' novels inspired you? But because of what you just said about being an amateur, and I also empathize with that greatly, I do still want to ask you that question with the caveat of what other novice-like experiences that you've had also influenced your experiences.
Well, I think that I actually did a list of climate fiction reads that, even if they weren't influential, I found really fascinating and interesting. And one thing about delving into these issues is it can be really irritating to read a novel that's supposed to be realistic as opposed to like fantastical, and it seems like they got it wrong. But the list of 10 that I have up on Goodreads, I think is a good starting place, because they're more unusual. Some of them aren't as well known, but I think they do a really good job. I'm reading a novel by Charlotte McConaughey, I'm probably saying that wrong, called Once There Were Wolves, that's out in August, which is set slightly in the near future, but really that's not the point. The point is it's about reintroducing wolves into Scotland, which of course hasn't happened, and the intricacies of that, and it deals so well with things like climate crisis and the way that we view animals, that I think it's a pretty amazing novel, and I think it's out in August or July. And then Alexandra Kleeman's Something New Under the Sun, which is set against the backdrop of California wildfires and manages to be both funny and horrifying about climate crisis. I think those are two novels out this year that I like quite a bit.
Okay, solid. Not you seeing a bobcat in St. Mark's. That wasn't.
Those kinds of things are definitely the moments where you don't have control, I think, are really important. The moments when you get lost, which is so hard to do. Of course, I don't carry a phone with me, so it's easier for me to get lost than some people. But those are moments that definitely come back into the novels, because I feel like they're rare experiences in our modern world. So definitely.
Got it. Speaking of moments, do you have a favorite moment you've witnessed in the wild or near Tallahassee, one that especially struck you recently?
Well, I think there are two. One's kind of mundane, but the other one's more ancient. And no one really believes me on this, but I was hiking in St. Mark's back in like 93 or 94. And I did see a Florida panther there. There was just no mistaking it. There's no way that you can mistake that long tail and the size of that thing and everything. It was definitely a medium size or maybe 2-year-old Florida panther. And it was the most amazing thing I've ever seen in my life. And my mind kept going, it's got to be a bobcat. It's got to be, what is it? It's something else. But there was no way it was anything other than a Florida panther. And of course, no one believes me, which kind of adds to the experience. But it was clear as day. And I just wish I'd gotten a photograph. But more recently, the one that really cracked me up was I was walking along the trail, and I just had this premonition to look back. And this whole area behind me on the trail had been completely empty. There was a family of otters just like going to town playing in a puddle. And if I hadn't looked back, so like ever since then, like on the last 3 hikes at St. Mark's, I keep looking back every single time, because it's like, maybe it's all behind me.
They know. Okay. So I want to get to this because got to help the students. Someone is studying to become an ecologist, and the further they get into their studies, the more they fear, for their future. Do you have any recommendations for staying hopeful? It's hard because it often seems those who have the power to make true differences are determined not to. Well, dag nabbit, let's give some hope.
Well, I mean, one bit of hope, and I mean, there's actually a website. so even though this is personal, you can still go to the website. My daughter Erin works for Metabolic, which is one of the leading like real sustainability companies in the world. Like they actually get stuff done. Like Charlotte's going to have a top down and a bottom up sustainability program through them that is that takes into account social justice, that takes into account all these things and actually works and doesn't have any loopholes. Like here in Tallahassee, we have solar panels, but we don't measure at all the amount of carbon brought into the city, or like, what would be brought in if this Amazon warehouse becomes a real deal. That kind of thing. It's like there's all kinds of things that we should be measuring that we're not. But anyway, so Erin has all the facts, and she says that we still do have a window to make this work. And so that gives me hope. I think that for me, though, it's very important to stay centered in the moment. Like I actually had a freak out on Facebook yesterday where I got really, really depressed about everything and just kind of freaked out in a post. And what usually, so that's okay too. It's just gonna happen, and maybe you're gonna freeze up from time to time. But if you can find that one thing to focus in the moment, and for me, it's going out and gardening for an hour. It might be something totally different. Even just getting 20 minutes away in nature or something else where you just are in the moment, you're engaged with exactly what's in front of you. The other thing that I remember is that I can make a possum for 3 years not know that there's a climate crisis going on. I can make a cardinal in our yard because of providing the food, not just the bird feeders, but the fruit and everything else, have a life that is devoid of that. And it's not that's important in a wider scale, perhaps, but it is important to how I'm able to then function on larger issues, because I feel like I'm making some kind of small difference. And it might be in some other area entirely, but if you can find that one local thing to do, it could be some form of activism, it could be volunteering at your church to plant wildflowers, I mean, it could be anything. But I think that really helps a lot to stay grounded, because it is a huge concern, and it's got to be much worse for climate scientists.
Yeah, not just reacting, but being proactive. Yes, thank you. All right, well, we only have time for really one more question, but I'm gonna squeeze in another.
Yeah, sure. I mean, it's fine with me.
So even though you just released Hummingbird and Salamander, do you already have another idea for another book?
Mm-hmm.
All right. Well, sweet.
Yeah.
I don't know if you can share that, but not.
Yeah, I do. I mean, it's the ideas are I tend to come in droves, and then I just write them slowly over the years. So I have another novel that I'm thinking about writing called Drone Love, in which escaped. It's set on an island surrounded by a ocean of plastic, where organisms have adapted to living in the plastic. And the island includes a monastery with the last drones, which are almost like prayer scrolls, and they contain the consciousnesses of various deceased people. There's no internet anymore. And surrounding the island are these monsters that are escapees from the last days of decadent biotech operas. So they actually sing through their pores, and they were meant to be in the backdrops of these operas singing. And they're so monstrous and deadly that even though you can hear them coming from miles away, because they can't shut off the singing coming from their pores, you usually don't survive hearing them. So that's kind of the setup for a mystery involving one of the prayer scrolls that's also a drone.
What did you eat the night before you fell asleep?
You know what? That actually came out of a
inspired.
conversation at University of Rice University in Houston, talking to a bunch of climate scientists and stuff.
Houston.
So
Houston. I hear Houston.
It's Houston. Yeah, it's Houston.
Houston. Okay. Oh, wow.
I didn't know just how that was going to sound. It's actually a realistic novel, but you wouldn't know it from that summary.
No. Totally. I can see it. Give it 40 years. Mm-hmm. Yeah, give it 40 years. Mm-hmm.
Now you're just humoring me. But yeah, I could take another question though. I'm happy to.
Oh, my last question was, can I get a hand-signed copy of my Hummingbird Salamander book?
Of course you can. You can get several if you want.
Yeah. That was a question I wanted to sneak in. Okay. Yeah. Really. And I think it's 8:04, and I think that's all the time we have, really. And so yeah, that's it. Thank you so much, Jeff. Thank you so much. Thank you to the many people who we have who signed up and who stuck it out with us, not just tonight, but for the whole year. It's been a tough year, but we made it, everybody. Thank you. I'm Dara Miles Wilson. I'm our communications chair. I'm looking so much forward to seeing you all either virtually or in person. I'm so grateful for this time and for the space that we all hold together. I thoroughly appreciate you all. Any more questions you all have? Jeff, how can we reach out to you?
I'll be on Twitter tonight, and I might even just open it up to questions there. So that's probably the best place. If you're on Twitter. I'm sorry, I'm not on Facebook that much recently because I have a password issue. So
what is what is your Twitter handle? So I can.
It's just Jeff VanderMeer.
Okay, so, at Jeff.
Yeah. And there's also an email there. So if for some reason, my email is just, what is it? It's just jeff@vandermeercreative.com. So if you don't use Twitter and you do have a question, I'll be happy to answer it if I can get around to it. Yeah.
So everybody, thank you very much. And please have a wonderful and safe evening. Thank you very much.
Good night.
Good night.